Yeah.
Okay,
How about you?
well, my name is Leslie Powell. I'm the host of this event. This is part of an ICPA book series that's just been started by the association. And the intent in the book series is on a monthly basis, roughly, to connect with authors from our associational members primarily, who have recently published books or have books coming up, and to have a conversation with them about the book project. So rather than the kind of formal, conventional academic presentations that are typical of these sorts of engagements, the idea is to have more of a podcast format where we engage in conversation and discussion about the book. Today we have Osmany Porto de Oliveira and Giulia Romano, who are the editors of a relatively recent book entitled Brazil and China in Knowledge and Policy Transfer, Agents, Objects, Time, Structures, and Power. Very interesting and engaging subtitle. So welcome to both of you. I thought before we actually plunge into the discussion about the book itself, each of you could give a little bit of background on yourself. So let's start with Osmany. A little bit of where you've come from for this particular project, but your larger research interests.
So, can everybody hear me? Good. Amazing. So I'm Osmany. I'm based at the Federal University of São Paulo in Brazil at the Department of International Relations. And I've been working on policy transfer for the past almost 20 years now. I had a first project which was my master and later on my thesis that aimed to study the international diffusion of participatory budgeting, which is a public policy that started in Brazil, and later on I started to look at other policies, Brazilian policies in particular at the national level, how they were being internationalized, such as conditional cash transfers and food security policies. And now I have a project on foreign policy, public policy, and South-South cooperation. And I'm working especially in two topics, climate change, fighting against hunger, and looking at three different venues, the OECD, the G20, and the BRICS Plus. So I've been mostly working on policy transfer, urban policies, social policies, and also some of these informal international organizations. I have been working a lot with the concept of a transnational policy process that I can discuss later with you. So that's me in 1 minute.
Great. Thank you, Osmany. Giulia?
Yeah, so hello, everybody. I'm Giulia Romano. I've been working in academia for 14 years, first as a PhD student in Sciences Po, where I started doing my research on policy transfers to China. And in particularly, I was interested in analyzing the impacts of international cooperation projects done in the name of sustainable urban development. So I have a really urban focus and public administration focus in my research, and China was my let's say focus of my study. I also studied Chinese when I was still a student, and then I worked for 7 years at the Institute of East Asian Studies of the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany as a postdoctoral researcher. I'm no longer engaged in research. I work now for a major German foundation for the support of students and research, the Hans Böckler Stiftung. But as Osmany, I've been interested myself. I mean, my focus of research has always been policy transfers and, first of all, let's say, analyzing the old direction, north to south, or if you want, west to east, because my focus was China. But more recently, with our book project, we started working on what China is actually promoting and diffusing in the rest of the world. My last project, which unfortunately wasn't published, I started working on the collaborations that companies like Huawei were developing with city governments in Europe for the transfer of ideas of smart city development. And but then that was history, so really a short description of what's my work about.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you both, and welcome again. So let's start with the sort of the big picture. Why a book on Brazil and China in terms of policy transfer? What's new and different, both about the global order and the international order, at least back at that time, because the book project, I think, began, if I remember correctly, from the preface around 2017, 20, or maybe 18. So the circumstances then, and I guess the bigger picture as well, and we'll come back to this in terms of how the circumstances internationally and globally may have changed for policy transfer. But give us a snapshot of the original rationale. Why a book on Brazil and China in terms of policy transfer? And maybe we can
Let's start, Osmany,
Do you want me to start, Giulia?
as you want, as you
Or
prefer.
you can start if you want, and I complement.
Okay, so basically, the book project started from an observation of a gap, of what we consider to be a gap in the field of policy transfer studies. And namely, as you know, for a long time, this body of research has focused primarily on transfers between countries in the so-called Western world or global north, or in the direction north to south. And they told us relatively little about policy transfer activities, or what we can consider the rest of the world. And in particular, those countries that a few years ago, and I guess still today, we call the emerging powers. These countries, however, have become very active and visible on the international stage, for example, as new donors and actors in international cooperation. And we thought it would be important to study what they do from a policy transfer perspective. And this is actually basically what emerged first from Osmany's original work, PhD work, where he focused, actually was the first one focusing on Brazil as an agent, as a major donor of policy idea and policy models. Maybe, Osmany, you want to say something about, yeah.
Yeah, so I started observing this. So the literature on policy transfer has basically, especially in the beginnings in the early 2000s, was mostly focused on how transfers were being undertaken between global North countries, inside the European Union countries, and so on. And what I started to observe in my empirics was that first, Brazil had this model, which was participatory budgeting, that was developed in a city in the south of the country called Porto Alegre. And this was developed in the late 80s, and 10 to 15 years later, it started to be a sort of best practice that was being adopted all over the world. And this not only in global south cities, but also all over Europe and the US. It was started to be adopted, and so on. So this was very interesting because it showed a sort of a counter movement, policy innovation that was produced in the global south, and that was being adopted everywhere. And I wanted to understand more about how this happened. What was the process? What were the mechanisms driving this diffusion? And this brought to my PhD thesis and my first book, which was published in 2017 by Paulo Macmillan, in which I explore how participatory budgeting was developed in Brazil and diffused all over the world. And I can continue this later, but I'll bring the hand over to Giulia again.
One aspect that we really want to point out about this book is particularly the perspective on policy transfer, because of course there was already a lot of work on, I can talk for the case of China, a lot of work on China and international cooperation, China and Africa. There's a really huge literature on that, or China participation in UN and UN agencies. But the studies, they often came from very different disciplinary perspectives. And what for us was very important is to really look at this policy dimension. What was the policy impact of all these activities abroad? So empirically, we felt the need to really start a conversation and encourage people to look at the activities of the countries from a policy transfer lens, first of all, to explore how they contribute to what we might call the global supply of policy ideas, policy models, policy options, conceptions. And on the other side, we also thought, what can we say from a theoretical perspective? Are there things that we have overlooked, or we can explore new things that we can explore? So the focus aimed really to the book wanted actually to start a conversation and bring new, fresh empirical insights from these countries, and start also maybe theorizing from these countries, because as you know, most of the literature, most of the theories come from the analysis of what happens in Western countries. And so we wanted to say, what about the rest of the world?
Yeah. Well, we'll get to the framework in a moment, but I mean, in a way, there was a serendipity involved in the book project, because you were working on China, you were working on Brazil, the two of you had worked together, and you decided to, I mean, this is the way a lot of book projects happen, right? It's two people coming together who enjoy working with each other, and then they figure out a way to combine their interests. But let's say that Giulia had been working on South Africa, and Osmany had been working on, I don't know, on India. I mean, obviously these are BRIC countries, but would it have made as much sense to do a book on policy transfer if you had those two, or if it had been Colombia and Singapore? Just picking randomly global South countries, or does it make much more sense to, again, serendipitously have stumbled on or picked on China and Brazil?
So can I start, Giulia, with
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
one? So Les, you basically described what happened. Giulia, I think she authorized me to tell this story, because we were at the ICPP in 2017, and I bumped into Giulia, and I said, "Hi, I'm Osmany, working on policy transfers in Brazil." And she said, "Oh, I'm Giulia, working on policy transfers in China." I said, "Oh, yeah, Brazil, China. We should compare. We should discuss. We should do more things together." And I think the idea, besides that, Giulia is from Italy, and I lived for part of my life in Italy. So we had this nice discussion also about policy transfers in other parts. But I think something interesting, and what we would like to push in this project, is this idea of also doing unconventional comparisons.
Yeah.
Obviously, Brazil and China are representative rising powers, each one from its region. So Brazil, Latin America, and China, Asia. But what is more frequent to see especially in policy studies, is that scholars are comparing similar countries, and there is this idea of comparing apples, and not comparing apples and I don't know, orange. So people compare Brazil, Argentina, United States, Canada, France, Germany. But we think that, and I'm pretty sure Giulia agrees with me, that when we start comparing countries that are more unconventional, let's say Argentina, Egypt, South Africa, Thailand, as you were bringing to the discussion, Les, I think that we can find very interesting things, and things that were maybe not covered by the literature. And this is what Giulia and I found out in our research. This is a way to innovate. So in order to innovate, you need to put different things together
into the mix.
Yeah.
Well, I can. Oh, go ahead, Giulia.
It's just a footnote to that. I mean, I say this is really the beginning of a conversation. We started from Brazil and China, but our wish is that it doesn't stop there, because we know that there is a lot of happening. We have colleagues working on the Philippines, colleagues working in Singapore, and there's really a lot going. That was really the point of okay, look at these big two actors. They're doing a lot, and there's not so much research on what they're doing in terms of policy transfer activities, but please go ahead and do analysis in other countries and build these unconventional comparisons, as Mani said.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, part of that question was pushing a little bit on the south dimension, because it clearly makes sense when you're talking about China and Brazil, because they're big actors, they've got capacity, and they've been involved for a long time. But if you take other smaller, less active countries in the South, could they be as active? I mean, so had you had different countries in your portfolio and still decided to go ahead, not so sure whether it would have had the same kind of traction. But I want to move on to the framework, but I also wanted to attest to the danger of having coffee with Osmany, because as soon as you do, then you end up having a project and 2 books and 6 conferences later. So that's what happened to me. So for any listeners, just
for the good, right?
all for the good, all for the good. Yeah. Well, let's get to the framework, because you take some time and put some effort in the introductory chapter to kind of lay out what you argue was kind of a fresh framework or a more elaborated framework for tackling policy transfer. So can you kind of unpack the framework that structured the book chapters in this edited collection?
Yeah. Well, in developing actually the framework, we basically started from the classic 5 and then 6 questions of the Dolowitz and Marsh model, which appeared late 90s and early 2000. And from there, we started doing 2 things. On one side, we wanted to try to enrich this classic framework of questions by integrating the new dimension and aspects that emerged over the past 2 decades in the literature, and not only in the policy transfer literature, but also to those adjacent fields like policy mobility or policy translation literature. One example was the book that you published, Les, with Magdalena Giski and Christopher Walker on the microdynamics of transfer. For me, that was path-breaking in a sense, because it made sense of what I did in my PhD thesis. I really analyzed the microdynamics of transfer in China, and I thought that we'd really had to insist on this dimension and say this is important that we integrate this aspect in the framework. Another example was the emergence of the policy mobility literature. It started as a critique to policy transfer studies, not so much welcome at that time in the early 2010, but we thought that it really brought some fresh insights, new ideas when it comes to analyzing, for instance, how a best practice becomes a best practice. Who are the agents who decide what has the dignity to become a best practice and what not, and who actually moves these best practices around the world? Or again, as I said, policy translation. So this is the first thing that we tried to do in the framework. But the second thing, we also wanted to bring in something of our own, coming from our own research. And in particular, I think Osmany's work, I think he can add something later, he highlighted really the importance of incorporating an analysis and a focus of international cooperation, international relations, and the analysis, asking what kind of objectives these policy transfer activities serve in terms of how a nation tries to actually diffuse its ideas and policies. Maybe Osmany, you want to add a bit more about this aspect?
Yes, for sure. Because so what we were observing, looking at the Brazilian case, was that in order to understand the Brazilian model, you couldn't remove this idea of development cooperation. Because what Brazil was doing at that time, as in policy transfer, was basically transferring knowledge on the well-succeeded, especially the social policies that were implemented in the country to other countries in the global south, in particular in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, with some focus on the Lusophone African countries. So basically, Brazil had this model that was using projects of development cooperation with different partners, where the Brazilian staff from the different sectoral ministries would, through missions, do workshops, field trip visits, and share information in order to capacitate, to do capacity building and train civil servants, public policy makers in other countries to develop social policies. So policy transfer and development cooperation were very, let's say, strictly intertwined in the Brazilian case at that moment. But that was important to look at the development lenses that so it doesn't show up when you look at European or the US or other countries.
Yeah.
Less, yeah.
It doesn't show up in the case of other countries, but Other countries, not every single country, but many countries will have an overseas development or development cooperation component to their foreign policy. Canada did and still does, but it used to have a separate agency for that. And that would be true, I think, of most of like Germany, for example. The Swiss, when I was in Doha, I was quite interested to work with the Swiss embassy and realize that they had very specific kinds of development cooperation interests, both in the Middle East and in Africa, and were coming at these interests in a very specific way that was distinct from, say, some other European countries or even North American countries. Where was I going with this? So I can really see how a development if you look seriously at development cooperation of a particular country, you can actually see a pretty important mechanism or channel of policy transfer that's quite deliberate and intentional. Now, other countries, I don't know, if you took a country like Indonesia, I just don't know whether they have the same emphasis or focus on overseas development cooperation as a developing country. So that's just a comment. But let me ask a particular question about the framework, which I found quite.
Can I just
Oh yeah,
can
sure,
I just rephrase? What I meant was yes, there is development cooperation in different countries. What I wanted to highlight is that at that point the literature was not considering this dimension.
Right.
And when you look to Brazil, it's kind of you can't avoid that. So we started to bring this into the discussion.
Right. That's perfect. Yeah. Can I ask about another dimension or component of the framework, and that's time. And this comes up in several of the chapters as well. And I thought that was a fresh perspective or a fresh addition to how we think about policy transfer. Can you comment on what you mean by time as a component of transfer, and what advantage do we get by incorporating that into our analysis? Giulia?
Yeah, well, that's definitely one aspect that emerged from our own research. There was few literature, I would say, at the time when we wrote the book. A few publications started mentioning the dimension of time, and we definitely consider this as an important dimension if we want to really understand how these processes unravel and what are the impacts on the ground. I could say for my case, when I did my own research in China, I needed to have this 20 years perspective in order to understand any impact and to see how the policy actually was implemented on the ground. And so we consider this aspect as a very fundamental dimension that we needed to incorporate more in our analysis in terms of looking at the rhythm of policy transfer, the different policy windows of policy transfer, the different times of transfer. And I think on that, then there have been sort of lot of developments happening. I think Osmany also published recently an article with another colleague on the dimension of time, right? It's a leitmotif
for sure.
in your research.
Yes, can I compliment a bit, Giulia?
Yes, please.
So the idea of I think time has been in policy diffusion studies and transfers for some time, but again, this has been also a dimension that's not being taken into account very, very seriously. And we couldn't avoid this observation of time. And I think Giulia mentioned so time is not only the sequence of events or the time passing, but we also wanted to frame time differently. So time, as Giulia mentioned, as a window of opportunity. At that moment, there was an important window of opportunity because Brazil was being seen as a model, which was not the case when we finished the book. And this is why we wrote also the preface. We were in a very different situation, but also China was in a very different situation. But there are also opportunities that can boost up policy transfers, the capacity of a country to transfer policies and also to be a model. There is this idea of a rhythm. Policy transfers can be more rapidly at a certain point and can become slow. And especially when you have, for example, different intervenient variables. Let's say there's a change in government, a political change. This can slow down policy transfers in a way, or can make it faster. So we started to look into different dimensions of time. The latest one, which is not covered in the book, but it's covered in a paper that was published with my colleague Michele Moraes in GCPA, which we bring this idea of lifetime of policy diffusion. And while looking, for example, to participatory budgeting and conditional cash transfers, these public policies have been diffused for around 3 decades. So things have changed. So the participatory budgeting that was diffused in the 90s as the conditional cash transfers today is something completely different, which means that new agents jump in, new character, the model changes, the meanings changes of the public policies and so on and so forth. And there are also waves and counter waves of policy adoption. So we try to develop also this to unpack time in policy transfer, and this was the start, the starting point for that Giulia and I brought to the discussion, to our reflection.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm thinking or guessing that a lot of policy transfer, maybe not so much in the diffusion field, but policy transfers research has tended to focus on episodic transfers of single policy objects. And then you ask the question of why, who was involved, what happened, what was the impact. But if you have cases where, like participatory budgeting, where you've got a life cycle that extends over decades under the same chapeau, be really interesting to see the rhythms, the changes, the alterations. I mean, something like sustainable development would be an even better kind of, concept, because you've got something starting in the 90s and it's under the same terminology, and many of the mechanisms and actors congeal around that particular concept. But what it is in 2025 is very different than what it might have been in 2015 or 2005. So that would be, we have the opportunity now maybe for these more longitudinal studies of transfer, which would really be interesting. Let me turn to actors, because that's also part of the framework. But one of the things I think that's interesting in several of the chapters, and it's in your framework as well, is the range of actors. And again, this is part and parcel of the traditional, 5-6 element of the typical framework, the conventional framework. We look at actors, but one of the things that is distinctive, two things that were distinctive about the actors, I think. The emphasis of the book is that we can't just think about state actors, that we need to think about and private sector actors is something that I don't think has been explored sufficiently. So that's one element of it. But the other one, particularly in the case of Brazil, I think, several chapters highlighted the role of international organizations, even the World Bank. Paradoxically, in the case of some of the innovations coming from Brazil that could be coded more progressive or left wing, you have international organizations becoming a kind of force multiplier for the transfer of certain kinds of policy frameworks coming from Brazil. So could you comment on these different types of actors and the kind of role that they play, both in the case of China or Brazil?
Yeah, well, I might say that just to return back, I tried to take an element of the framework. We also, one of the dimensions that we insisted on, it was exactly the fact that there exist many actors, as you say, many agents. And the point was there really to underline how policy transfers are very complex things. There was a tendency in the literature, and this, if I don't go wrong, it was a critique also of policy mobility scholars, to try to understand policy transfers as a sort of linear path from point A to point B. And what they try to illustrate with their own research is that they're really not linear processes, and a lot of actors, they engage in these processes, and they really play a role in changing. We also told that with the case of participatory budgeting, which has the same label, but the contents have changed a lot. So one point of the book was really to understand that there are really multiple actors. And even when we're talking in the book about Brazil and China, but we invite, in the conversation, we really invited our colleagues to unpack this concept of what is Brazil, what is China, because we are seeing that there is a multiplicity of agents. Even if you just look at the activities in terms of international cooperation, in the case of the Chinese government, you have a lot of ministries which are involved in these activities, and often they push very different policy objectives, with the result that the policy sometimes is fragmented, is incoherent. You see this with the BRI, with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
And that is very difficult also to put up and coordinate this kind of policy. So what is China in this picture? Then you correctly say there are a lot of also of private actors. And I can think about the case of Huawei, on which I did research recently. It's interesting, first of all, because it's a private actor. Somebody could say to me it's a pseudo private actor, because we think about what is the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on its own companies. But it's very interesting what they do. What I observed in the case of Duisburg, they started a cooperation in 2018 for the concept of smart city. And what I observed, it was not just a cooperation between Huawei and the city of Duisburg. There was a multiplicity of actors involved, from local governments from everywhere in the world, not only in China, and even small and medium enterprises. So basically, these corporations, they provide a sort of platform for a variety of agents to have a role, to bring their own contribution to this collaboration. And when you observe this, the question is, where is China? What actors? The reality is much more complex on the ground. That's why we encourage with our framework to really take a very close perspective on case studies and analyze really the different mosaic or constellation of actors.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if I could just, before we get to Osmany, just highlight the 2 points in that answer. One is, of course, the book title says Brazil, China, and our tendency is to think Brazil, China, Canada, Germany. We think of these national categories, but what is emanating from China or emanating from Brazil could be a variety of different actors and initiatives, all under, connected to that national entity. But in the aggregate, they could have quite interesting and even fragmented effects and impacts. So that's really quite interesting. And I think particularly with the Chinese case, as I mentioned to you before we started the recording of the podcast, I just came back from China yesterday, and I was really struck at the relative autonomy, to use an old term from the Marxist literature, the relative autonomy of different actors and players in the policy spaces in China. So that, our tendency, our instinct is to, particularly in the Chinese case, I think less so necessarily in the case of something like Brazil, is to assume a unilinearity and a unity of action, everything emanating from the CPC and Xi Jinping right down to the micro activities of private companies. But it's much more complicated and much more fragmented and looser and less coordinated, I think, than we tend to presume. Sorry, I took the floor from you, Osmany.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's an amazing comment, Laz. When we bring this dimension of the we call agents, including different types of organizations and non-organization and individuals. We call agents of policy transfers. And what we were observing was, for example, in the case of Brazil, the president was one of the main promoters of Brazilian policies. Yeah. So when you have, one thing is you have a bureaucrat or a consultant or staff from international organizations saying, oh, this is an important tool for other countries to adopt. The other thing is when you have the president of the republic, someone very popular with international recognition, that is saying people should do like this, should do conditional cash transfer, should do school meals. This combination, this is where it starts to get interesting and intertwined with international relations, because this was something that emerged from presidential diplomacy. Presidential diplomacy became also a tool for policy transfer, especially in the discourse. The other aspect that you mentioned are the international organizations, and something that was very interesting for us. That it's at least two dimensions. So the first one was the presence of international organizations such as World Bank that you mentioned that were very interested in public policies made by the global South countries, and they were actively promoting this the diffusion of these policies. So they were helping to the massive diffusion. Once an international organizations recognize that this is the model that other countries should follow, it has a massive impact on diffusion. They were also providing fund and capacity building and so on, such as the World Bank with conditional cash transfers. It was not only with Brazil, but with other Latin American countries as well. But something that is very interesting to understand and to notice is that international organizations are not a block, a monolithic entity. They're composed by people.
Yeah.
And at the point where, and this was very clear in the case of Brazil, when Brazil starts to become, to implement and test and have results domestically with food security policies, fighting against poverty policies, family farming policies, these experts start to be to get access either to international organizations. So they either because they apply for jobs there in these organizations, or because they are hired as consultants, because they are experts and so on. But also in the case of Brazil, the Food and Agriculture Organization for a long time had a Brazilian general director. So there's also this circulation of people from national government or NGO, national government, to international organizations that makes also that policy transfer process keep moving. So this is a very interesting thing to know. It's not the international organization, but rather something more complex.
Yeah. I mean, there were a couple, I can't remember which chapter in particular, but mentioned exactly that, this kind of migration of Brazilian experts into some of the international organizations who then carried with them their ideas and then actualized them within that international organization. But as another footnote to that comment, and I think both of you have been working or have worked on the OECD, but when I was working on the OECD, it was striking that we tend to, again, it's this the use of the title of an organization or a country to say the OECD does X or China does X or Brazil does X. In the case of the OECD, and I'm sure in other international organizations, often the member countries and states within them would, in the case of the OECD, have voluntary contributions and decide to fund and support certain kinds of projects. So what looked like an initiative of the OECD would often actually be something that Germany or France or Canada was deliberately funding and pushing. So it became less an OECD project, or in the case of other organizations, a World Bank project or something else, than the project that was forwarded and pushed by a specific entity within the organization. So that's another aspect of transfer with respect to international organizations that we lose sight of sometimes by just assuming that there's a unity to the organization itself. We're running a little bit of a fascinating conversation. I want to be sure that we pick up on some of the key questions that I shared with you. I think a lot of people would be very interested in exploring or having some discussion about the role of the two countries in Africa specifically. And you had two chapters in the book, chapter 5 by Laura Weisbig, I think is the pronunciation, and George Lamich on knowledge transfer by Brazil and China to Africa. So, and this is a nice case as well of illustrating perhaps the differences between how China approaches its policy transfer and how Brazil does. So could you both, I mean, it's a little unfair to ask you to comment on chapters you didn't write, but if I could ask you to maybe just illustrate some of the differences in approach between the two countries with respect to Africa particularly.
We try to do our best in order to make justice to those contributions, which were very rich. But what we notice is that there are a lot of similarities between the two countries, but of course, a couple of major differences. One thing that we notice is that both countries, they frame their engagement in Africa in terms of South-South cooperation. So meaning that they present this as a sort of mutual assistance between developing countries rather than the traditional donor-recipient relationship. And this framing is important because it reflects a shared political narrative of solidarity and partnership. And you can really see this a lot also in the discursive and in the policy documents, for instance, that of the Chinese government in this when produced for in the occasion of these big meetings with African countries. Another similarity that we notice is that also in both cases, development assistance is closely tied also to their own foreign policies. But also, as I said before, we find also a lot of fragmentation. As I said, the Chinese government might have specific objectives, policy objectives when it comes to its relationship with Africa, but the different ministries have also very different objectives, and this ends up in sometimes this weakens, let me put it like this, the coherence of China's development strategy and foreign policy. And I think also Brazil is facing the similar challenge. I mean, the problem of fragmentation is a common problem everywhere in the world. Ministries, they push with different strategies and different objectives. Another aspect that we noticed, albeit with differences in terms of timing, I would say, is that both countries, they also make use of triangular cooperation, often working with international organizations like the UN or the FAO. But I say there's a difference in terms of timing because this is a more, let me put it like this, a more recent trend in the case of China, whereas in the past, I mean, the classical way of engaging African countries and in general, the model of international relations of the push by the Chinese government is more state-to-state bilateral relationship. So this is it's a more recent thing. Whereas in the case of Brazil, Brazil has long worked with international agencies and non-state actors, and its model of cooperation is also more inclusive. Maybe then Osmany later will tell us a little bit more. When it comes to big differences, I think one thing that we notice in the case of China is that China's approach is still state-centric, largely state-centric, and possibly coordinated from above. And so while it has started to engage in international channels and even sometimes engages with actors of the civil society, they doesn't treat them like central players. Whereas if I correctly understood, again, also I invite Osmany to help me in this. Brazil relies on broader partnership. It involves NGOs in its operations in Africa, and it gives cooperation a more horizontal and participatory character. Osmany, maybe you want to say something more about this.
Yes. So as you mentioned, Les, hard to comment on someone else's chapter. Let me give some overview of the Brazil and Africa relations in 1 minute, and then I'll invite you to read the chapter of Laura, outlining a little bit of what she highlights in her chapter. So at a certain point, a couple of decades ago, Brazil started to build a foreign policy strategy, which was based on different things. Among these, trying to get a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, but also to play a more leadership role, being a sort of a voice for the Global South and so on. And Brazil started to strengthen the relations with African countries. One of the things Brazil did in this broader strategy of foreign policy was to increase the number of embassies, of Brazilian embassies in Africa, and the other was to invest in South-South cooperation. And as I mentioned, South-South cooperation was basically transferring, not all of it, but an important part was transferring policies, well-succeeded policies to Brazil. But this was also part of this broader strategy. So when a delegation of Brazil was visiting an African country, not only the policy experts were going with the delegation, but this was also an opportunity to bring the private sector. So the private sector was also there with this delegation in order to try to open new markets for Brazil. It's questionable either if this was well succeeded or not, but this was happening for a long time. So South-South cooperation was a way to materialize a broader foreign policy strategy with African countries, and also to build this idea, which is also a soft power idea, that Brazil was a role model for the global South, and our cooperation was based on solidarity and not on conditionality, as the World Bank was doing, for example, for a long time, and the IMF, and so on and so forth. So it was also about building this counter narrative in the international system. This was not always the case, and what Laura discusses in her chapter, which is very interesting. Laura discussed the history of in this past 20 years of Brazilian engagement in South-South cooperation in Africa, and she discusses how the increase of this cooperation until a moment that was a sort of an ebb, reflux of this South-South cooperation, because especially during the government of Bolsonaro, it was not a priority on the agenda. The priority of the agenda was to connect with the OECD, with the US, and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting chapter, and she discusses this. And it was also something that I need to highlight here, and Laura makes the discussion in her chapter. Brazil didn't start with capacity to do South-South cooperation and policy transfers. It was a learning by doing process a long time. And this is very important to mention, because often we forget that when we analyze episodes of policy transfers, we forget about the process of learning about how to do policy transfers. So I don't know if I made myself clear, but this is 20 years of, and at the end, let's say in 2016, Brazil had a lot of knowledge accumulated on how to relate with African countries, how to incorporate the World Bank or other international organizations or other partners, and so on and so forth.
This element of building domestic knowledge about policy transfer is quite interesting. I mean, maybe a partial example of that, again, to mention, I mean, to go back, I just got back from China, but at Tsinghua University, at the School of Public Policy and Management, I discovered that they have I think, a relatively new program. I may be getting the title wrong, but it's a Master's of Public Policy or Public Administration and Belt and Road Initiative. So it's actually a master's degree in studying the BRI. And I'm sure it's open to international students, but it's an interesting example of building capacity and knowledge about your transfer activities, in this case through an academic program. What Osmany was referring to was just the accumulated learning, maybe within ministries and government agencies. But that could be a whole other branch of interesting research. I mean, how do countries learn about what they're learning in terms of transfer, and then how does that loop back or feed back into what they're doing in terms of policy? Speaking of new areas of research, the book had a very we only got time for a couple of questions, and then there may be some questions from our audience, but very interesting postface, which I don't think I've ever seen in a book before. I've seen prefaces, but not preface, but not a postface. And I think you wanted to look at the impact of the pandemic specifically as you were finalizing the book. But at the end of this concluding chapter, if that's what it is in the book, you talk about a few potential areas or interesting areas of future research, and there were two that I just wanted to ask your views on. One was the role of cities and local governments And again, this is something that I think both of you have done a lot of work on, but it's still probably undeveloped within the field. And the second one, again, you simply allude to this, you don't develop it, was the impact of right-wing or conservative movements and parties in building new circuits of policy transfer. Osmany was referring to Bolsonaro. But I think there's a more interesting terrain there to explore in terms of movements that are counter progressive, I guess is the way to put it. So cities and local agents of transfer, and then the impact of right wing or conservative policy transfer channels and their growth.
Absolutely. I might start, Les, as I am probably the person in this book who's more interested in cities. I mean, as a disclaimer for our public also, I'm not a foreign policy expert or an expert of China's policy, but I'm an expert of cities. I always worked with public administration at the local level. And so I absolutely think that we really need to engage and do more research on the role of cities in policy transfers. This was a point which is not completely new, because already the policy mobility literature actually invited scholars not to consider just the nation state as major, let's say, actors or promoters of policy transfer, but cities are also very active. But there is still a lot to do, and there's still a lot to do from an empirical point of view and also from a conceptual point of view. From a conceptual point of view, that came out recently in 2023, an article from two scholars who contribute to the policy mobilities literature, who are actually underlining how, yes, we've done a lot of work, but we haven't done so much into understanding what happens once these policies land. What happens into policy processes? How are they locally adapted? How do they take root, or are they rejected? So a sort of conversation that we also had in policy transfer studies. And what they actually were pointing out or were indicating is that it's very important that policy mobility literature combines the tools of public policy analysis to better understand what happens on the ground. And I can only underline that because this is what I try to do with my own research. I think that we need really to, join forces, geographers and public policy scholars, in understanding exactly how policies move and how policies try to take root in specific localities, and who are the agencies, what are the local policies, and so on and so on. And from an empirical perspective, there's still really a lot to do. A clear example, I think, that there's some research on it, but not really from policy transfer scholars, not really generated from the public policy community, let me put it like this, is what cities are doing, like cities like Singapore, for instance, or Yokohama. I think about East Asia because this is the region that I focus on with my own research. But you have cities like Singapore that they have their own specific organizations, like the Center for Livable Cities, who are very active agents of knowledge transfer and policy transfer in the region, in the area. Or the city of Yokohama has a specific foreign affairs office that works as a sort of platform for the local companies in Yokohama to try to actually diffuse their own technologies and experiences when it comes to recycling or industrial transformation, regeneration. So there's really a lot also to be explored empirically. Or we can also see that cities, I was last year in Japan, was starting to do a sort of project with a colleague there. And we notice how there are really a lot of city-to-city partnerships, Japanese cities with Southeast Asian cities, under also the leadership of a ministry. And again, they try to use these cooperations to promote specific ideas, but also to promote their own companies. Then we can think about ICLA. I mean, there's some research on this, but we didn't really analyze what are the impacts in terms of policy transfer of networks, transnational networks like ICLA or C40. There are different ones. And then, as I said before, there are also some kind of hybrid forms as the one that observed in the case of Huawei, where you have a company that works as a platform and tries to gather together different actors like small and medium enterprises from elsewhere in the world, other cities, and build cooperation. So there's really a lot to do empirically and also conceptually, because we try to also to understand what are the specificities of these partnerships? What are the modalities of transfer? What kind of objectives these actors also pursue, which might be very, very different from states, of course.
Can I just jump in and ask two follow-up
Yeah.
questions? If you could answer briefly, Giulia, because I want to get to Osmany. But smart cities, do you think that has become a kind of overarching concept or platform that will enhance both the cooperation or activities by private sector actors, particularly in the tech sector, but also elevate the importance of cities as arenas of transfer? Because there was a smart cities conference in Doha when I was there, and I was quite astonished to see the participation globally of different representatives from cities, because everybody wants to get on that particular bandwagon. So a brief answer to that. And then the second question was, do you know, I just don't know how much work has been done on twinning. I mean, there's this phenomenon of cities twinning, and whether that is something that would be interesting to explore in terms of transfers, because the twinning typically takes place between cities that are quite geographically dispersed. So two questions, quick answers, and then we'll turn to Osmany.
Yeah, sure. Smart city is a big buzz concept, and today cities are trying to position themselves in order to sell their models abroad, or even sell their own experience, and try to even create within their agencies some part of branches which are more dedicated to marketing. I find this phenomena very fascinating. I mean, especially for cities who are, I can say for the case of Duisburg, which is a city which is, in the rural area in Germany. So old steel and coal industry. It tries to find a new position in the world, try to find a new position from an economic perspective. And it wanted to use the smart city thing in order to create its own niche for other cities that are similar, let me put it like this, in terms of economic situation and dimension, to sell its own experiences. And I find it really fascinating. Unfortunately, I haven't pushed it with the project. And the second question was
twinning.
There again, there's a lot of work to do. There's not so much in terms of exploring what happened. The literature, because I did a short publication on this, on city twinning between a Chinese city and Duisburg. We mentioned that there happened, knowledge transfer happened, but in which terms or what exactly, there's really not research on this.
Okay.
So again, there's a lot to do.
Osmany.
Yes, just my a couple of comments on these questions, Les. So the first one, I wanted to highlight or reinforce what Giulia mentioned on these transnational networks. I think they're so important, and in policy studies, we are not taking them into account too seriously. For example, when we look to climate change, it's so impressive how cities have been organizing themselves through these networks and organizing these strategies. They are much more effective than national governments. For example, they're building their coalitions, sharing experiences, learning. Climate actions plans are being implemented in most capital cities all over the world, and this is very impressive, very interesting for understanding. The other question on far right, I think this is still very underexplored by the literature. For example, Brazil and the US exchanged either directly or indirectly strategies policy making. Now Brazil is not part of this movement anymore, but for example, US and Argentina are very well connected and learning from each other. Maybe Argentina more from the US. But this is something very underexplored, and that we should understand what are the dynamics of this far right policy exchange. What are they doing? There's nothing, to my knowledge, being conducted. Only there was one study. A colleague has a research on this, but nothing published so far. So it's a very interesting avenue, especially considering the post-truth situation with false information circulating around and so on.
Right. We have a few people that are online. I mean, one of the purposes of these interviews or book talks is to, since we're recording them, to make them available through the JCPA, ICPA channels for our associational members and then the wider public to use for teaching purposes, etc. But if I will open the floor momentarily because we're close to the end of our hour. If there are any questions from our participants or audience. I will let that hang for 1 second, 2 seconds. Yes, Monica, please. I think you can join online. Yeah. Yes.
I was typing it when you switched.
Okay.
When I made it shorter. First of all, thank you for the twinning question you raised, because I was asking questions about it. Maybe because I have a German background from my birth, and also because I live in France, and twinning is very important, played a huge role to overcome the war consequences. So maybe Japan, Korea, and China should exercise in twinning. Cities, professions, not only cities, professions, administrations, all sorts of things are twinned. One of the questions, it's a very empirical one, but then I have two others. One is there in the literature or in your knowledge about the policy transfer subject, any general lesson that was drawn from the German unification? Because that was a huge transfer thing where everybody was involved, but there should be, the state down to children from kindergartens and professions and everything. The whole policy system was changed. So is there any theoretical knowledge taken from that or policy lessons? The other question is, more general. After all you know about it, especially from your literature review and also from your book, are there any policy sectors or activities which are particularly frequent or particularly easy to transfer and then happened frequently? And what are these sectors? I know social policy is one of them, but there may be, many others. And the other question, what is the worst sector, the most difficult to transfer? Spontaneously, I would say all the justice system and prisons and the punish system, how you punish people for what? It's probably difficult, but maybe I'm wrong, it's just an idea. And the last question is a little bit similar. There are all these many actors from states, other private foundations, which are sometimes big like small states, international relationships, alliances and all sorts of things. What are the best or the most efficient actors or the most frequent ones for successful policy transfer? What type of actors, if you make categories, probably, or international organizations, and you have mentioned all of them, but what are the types of facility actors have, or certain branches or whatever? That's all. Thank you.
3 wonderful questions.
Thank you very much for this great conference. It's nearly a conference.
Thank you, Monica. Okay, the floor is to our guests, Giulia, Osmany. 3 questions. One about the lessons learned from German unification. Second question, are there particular areas that are easier or harder to transfer? And the third one was, I think, the most frequent or most effective actors. So again, brief responses, but those are challenging questions. We could have almost another session on those.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, they are indeed. I'm not very much familiar. Let me put it like this. We didn't really, in the exploration of the literature review, we haven't come across literature on the German reunification, but I know that there are some French scholars, if I remember correctly, that did some research on the impacts of reunification and what happened at the different policy sectors. I don't recall any more the names and the works because it was a really long time ago. But I know that has been some literature on that. I jump on the question of the actors who are most important, because this is something that probably emerges very clearly from my own research that I did in China when it comes to who are the core actors that make a policy transfer successful. And I really think it's the local actors. what in development cooperation literature are called the project owners, or what I prefer calling the policy entrepreneurs in the local government, in let's say in the government that adopts a policy, made it be the national level or the local level. They are the fundamental ones. If you have them, if they're convinced that they want to try to push for the policy, they will try to do all what they can in the use all the channels and all the opportunities they have to push for that policy. And this has emerged, as I said, in my own work, but I saw it in different works dedicated on policy making in China. If you and this somehow reconnects to the question you made, Leslie, that there's much more than just the apex of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. I mean, there's a lot of moving, and there's a real lot of policy entrepreneurs who are very engaged and passionate. And if you have them, you have chances that something has success, and policy transfer has success.
Osmany.
Yeah, so let me pick the middle question, which was, are there easier or more complicated policies? So it depends case by case. So let me give two examples. So last year, tax reform was approved in Brazil. And it was under discussion for decades. And there was this momentum, and it was finally approved. And if I'm not wrong, it's not my area of expertise, we adopted the dual VAT value aggregate tax model that is based on the Canadian. I think the Canadian model is like that. So this is what we adopted. That's a very hard policy to transfer, because you need to have convince the different types of society, and also the political elites, and there are many law institutional norms that need to be harmonized or created in order to transfer such policy. Is something very big. When you compare to city policy, let's say participatory budgeting, or a policy that's aimed to produce adaptation, like in urban areas, like permeable urban areas, this is much more simple. So it's hard to say, oh, this policy is more complicated, this is easier. And also it depends on the acceptance of a policy. So it's hard to say, but you need to understand the complexity. How many agents? What are the degree of conflict around the policy? What is the complexity of the model, and so on and so forth. So it really depends from my perspective, and this is how I can answer in 1 minute.
That would be, but it would be interesting and challenging to try to come up with some theoretical predictors or at least highlight some factors that might make a difference. I was struck by, just to rephrase it slightly, the greater with your tax example, the greater the scope of the transfer in terms of its impact societally, in principle, the harder it'll be to transfer, right? Because you're affecting more people and more sectors, and consequently raising the probability of opposition. The more narrow and focused, like if you a transfer in the agricultural sector or to soybean producers or in the healthcare sector, maybe the odds, the probability of acceptance and successful transfer is higher because the scope has been reduced and is more specific. Just kind of playing with that idea is really quite interesting.
But it doesn't need to be like this. For example, you can have the opposition of the president of the republic, and that's and it
doesn't happen.
The policy might be simple, but if it's not on the
right. Well, look, we've gone over time a little bit, and but I will take my prerogative as host or chair to ask one last kind of general question before we wrap up, and that's the circumstances in 2025 are quite different than the circumstances pre-pandemic and even afterwards when you were writing the book. And in fact, one of the rationales that you pose for the book is the background global. The global system has changed, and we can expect policy transfer to occur more frequently and south transfers to occur more frequently. So for launching the book or conceiving the book, you had a particular kind of global system or global framework in mind. One could argue, I think, plausibly, that the global system is in a process of change, the collapse of the liberal international order and all the stuff that you're familiar with. We have Mr. Trump in power. We have USAID that's gone. Much more suspicions about China, kind of China anxiety about its activities. International organizations seem to be weaker. And there are new axes of cooperation that are not necessarily south-south, like China and Russia, that are articulating or attempting to articulate a counter global hegemony or a counter global order to the US. So I'm just wondering, and this is a really big question to close on, but do you see a continued south-south transfers, policy transfers in this context? Or what are the implications for this changing international and global context for policy transfer?
Osmany, maybe you're more familiar with the recent times. Maybe I can add something later.
So what I have a current project that's discussing exactly this, Les. So let's say that during when we were working on the Brazil-China project, for example, the SDGs, fighting against poverty, hunger, was something on the global agenda, at one of the top of the development global agenda. Today, we can see that maybe it's not anymore. It's still something very important, but it's not the priority. The priority now it's climate change, and also the two big conflicts that are kind of maybe going to an end in the following months: Israel, Hamas, and the Russia-Ukraine. So these things are something were not at the international system when we were thinking of the book. And also the very aggressive critiques of the multilateral system. But what we are also observing and discussing is that today, for example, in the climate change sector, the ecosystem is growing a lot. So if we think of the COP28 in Dubai, around 100,000 registered participants. That's a lot of people interested in climate change, including NGOs, indigenous movements, governments, private sector, and so on. Also, I'm looking particularly now to the BRICS. So the BRICS expanded, and after the announcement of the tariffs, the individual countries' tariffs by the United States, Brazil was very affected because of that. And the BRICS Plus emerged as a solution. So Brazil started to look at different markets. When we look to the BRICS now, and this is also something that can be said to the G20, but more for the BRICS has expanded so much on what regards discussions and working groups and initiatives related to sectoral policies that it's very impressive. So this year, the presidency is with Brazil, and we counted over, I don't have it just here, but we have counted over 200 events related to sectoral policies. So it means that cooperation and exchange is going there. There's something very interesting to look at. So there are changes in the global system, but I think that South-South cooperation exchange is still ongoing and still valid to pay attention at.
May actually be enhanced.
Yeah.
In a world where the US is withdrawing and sort of the north-south transfers are going to be less relevant.
Exactly. I
It
just
can,
wanted
yeah.
to put a footnote on that, but exactly, I think this is a window of opportunity for this country actually to take a more proactive role and being seen really as an alternative whereas when in the current situation, Western countries are really, withdrawing a certain way or looking more inwardly or being silent on questions where we want them not to be silent. So I think it's a great opportunity for China, for Brazil, but other countries also to be seen as alternatives and provide alternatives, and for this all different activities to unroll more and more.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Well, thank you very much for your
And let's
time. Oh, yeah.
can I just say something before you
Sure.
close? And
Sure.
I think that Giulia will endorse my words. We were the leaders of this project, but we did this with
Of
a
course.
different group of scholars. So
Yeah.
all the ideas that came in the introduction and the theoretical framework, we didn't came up to them by ourselves. So we did an important workshop at the Institute of Development Studies in 2018 in in England, and then we reconvened at the University of Duisburg in Germany with a group of scholars as well, which are the authors of the chapters, to discuss all the chapters. And this is from where the majority of these ideas came from. So we owe all these people a lot. So it's a collective work.
Absolutely. And I am just looking for. Okay, I'm glad you reminded me of that, and that's one of the challenges of having this kind of conversation, because we couldn't bring all of the authors onto a single 1 hour conversation, so we default to the editors, but it was a collective effort, and that's something important to underline. So let me once again share the title with everyone. It's Brazil and China in Knowledge and Policy Transfer: Agents, Objects, Time, Structures, and Power. It came out in 2022, but as you can see, the issues that were raised in the book are continue to be relevant, if not even more relevant today than they were at the time when the book was conceived. So let me extend my thanks to Giulia and to Osmany for taking the time to join us, and to Darren and our colleagues in Tsinghua, who helped organize the platform for this great conversation. And for any of the listeners, and then subsequently when it's used in classrooms, I think a lot of really interesting research issues were raised here, and we can see that there continue to be all sorts of fascinating avenues of inquiry that remain in this area. So once again, my thanks to the co-editors of the book, and best of luck in your continued research and your activities. So thanks very much, guys.
Thank you very much, Leslie.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Okay, great.
Thank you, ICPA. Thank you, Tsinghua. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.